Hi, I'm Christian Dunn, Managing Partner at Strategic Institute for Innovation and Government Contracting. I'm sitting down once again with Rick Dunn, founder of Strategic Institute for Innovation and Government Contracting. And today we're talking about AOs versus KOs, agreements officers versus contracting officers. Are their roles similar? An agreements officer is what we call the contracting personnel in another transactions agreement, and then obviously under FAR, we call contracting officers. Here today to distinguish between the two and talk about the different roles that they can or do serve is Rick Dunn. Rick, give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, I think this is an important issue. And I think DoD leadership has done a great disservice to professionals who administer OTs and have the title agreements officer. The agreements, the interesting thing is that we have OT agreements officers, but under the DoD grants and agreements regulations, we have agreements officers who don't have authority to enter into or administer OTs. They only have authority to enter into and administer cooperative agreements under the Dodgers system. So we have a language issue at that level. And then in addition to that, we have a lot of agreements officers who are operating basically in the same manner that they perform their duty as a contracting officer. And that's because their leadership, their contracting office leadership thinks there is very little difference between the environment of a FAR procurement contract and other transactions.
Is there?
Well, there is. And I think many of the professionals who are required to perform both roles have difficulty transitioning back and forth. One day they're a contracting officer, the next day they're an agreements officer. So I'm going to try to lay out some of the differences. Historically, I mean, the very first OT agreement that we entered into at DARPA, there was no agreements officer. There was no person in a contracting office that was named in the agreement as having any role. The signer of the agreement was the director of DARPA, the person that the statute said had authority to enter into the agreement. The person who actually oversaw and was the interface between the private sector company and the government had the title scientific officer, and in fact was the program manager that ran the program, that had the technology and the budget to do what the agreement carried out. The agreement mentioned the contract management office of DARPA, which was said to be the source of contract administration for the agreement, but no individual in that office was even named in the agreement. So that goes to show you how much distance there can be between the traditional way of doing things, where we say the contracting officer is the only person who can obligate the government. No one could make changes to the contract other than the contracting office. In the world of other transactions, those rules just don't apply, and they don't have to apply.
And this is something that folks do have some challenge with, is that, when we say that other transactions are outside of the FAR system, none of those rules apply. I mean, some of that education, understanding the body and understanding what goes into a contract obviously applies and why those things are there. But the hard and fast rules of the FAR rule system and regulations do not apply.
No, they don't. And the point is, in formulating a contract, I mean, the essence of a contract is freedom of contract. It's two or more parties getting together and creating a relationship, creating conditions that are enforceable at law. And when you import a lot of regulations and overlay it into the contracting system, your freedom of contract is very limited. And you end up with basically, as what the FAR does, a highly regulated purchasing system. Whereas OTs are looking at a much broader spectrum of opportunities for relationships, multi-party agreements. One of our early agreements at DARPA had 7 companies sign the agreement. Why? Well, some of those companies were competitors. They didn't want to enter into a prime subcontractor relationship with their competing entity, although they could work together if it was defined correctly. So that's just quite a different structure of an agreement than a FAR contract, 2-party contract.
It's a different world, isn't it?
It's not just a buyer-seller relationship, and that's what FAR regulates. And when you bring the FAR mindset into the OT world, you narrow your vision. You
like to make the point, as under FAR, and I think you even know the statute, that the main duty of a contracting officer is compliance. And in OTs, we're talking more about facilitating and advancing mission goals. That's kind of a very different mindset.
It absolutely is. I mean, if you read Part 1 of FAR, I mean, it sounds like a contracting officer has a lot of freedom of action and can use business judgment and is supposed to be a part of an acquisition team. Well, all those things are true about OT, but in the actuality of the FAR world, what you have to do is dot all the I's and cross all T's and make sure every law, executive order, and regulation is being complied with. And the compliance part of another transaction is a minuscule percentage of what's required for FAR. So the emphasis of the work of a FAR contracting officer and an OT agreements officer is just quite different. And not restricting yourself to this highly regulated purchasing system mindset allows the signer of the agreement, along with his or her teammates, to structure the agreement in ways that are may be far different than a FAR contract. An OT may look very similar, maybe a 2-party agreement with a fairly specific goal, which ends up with a deliverable for the government, but it can be something really different than that. And by having a warranted contracting officer in the context of a contracting office be your FAR agreement officer, that's the limiting issue. I mean, that's what
OT agreement officer.
Your OT agreements officer. I mean, many of the contracting offices the first page of their OT is actually the same standard form that's the first page of a procurement contract. And so there's just this sort of magnetism that you're drawn back to business as usual in the FAR system. Again,
my understanding is there's a lot of literally cutting and pasting in the FAR system that contracting officers do.
Well, the terms and
agreements officers, you're now opening up the aperture where, I mean, yes, that knowledge applies that but but all of this is now flexible. You're now sitting down and negotiating, and you're agreeing to things with other parties, which is less likely to occur or doesn't happen as much in the FAR system.
Well, and I think we just emphasized the importance of a vision statement in one of our recent resources. And the reason why a vision statement is important is because you're not just in a single mold. You're not just in a buyer-seller relationship between 2 parties necessarily. And you need to have that discussion up front, laying out the vision of the agreement and the goals of the parties, which, as I think we said, need at least to be congruent, if not identical. You need to have those discussions. And when you have those discussions, that makes the negotiation of the detailed terms and conditions much easier than if you just start pulling pieces of paper out and shoving it across tables. So
there's clearly a lot of trouble going on. I mean, just this week we saw an article where Defense Innovation Unit and National Security Innovation Network, 2 entities that have partnered together, now are looking for a third entity to do the paperwork and administration, and an OT consortia That leads me to believe that they don't have the internal capability, the conceptual internal capability to do these agreements in which they characterized as complex. Agreements that we're talking about that any business person with common sense would be able to look at an OT agreement and go, oh, all of this makes sense. It's the FAR stuff. It's the FAR system that's the oddity in the business world. That's
Right.
the stuff that would be hard for me to understand. I would have no problem understanding an other transaction agreement. It's not complex. It just takes thought.
And that's what you just said is the argument of why people who, other than warranted FAR contracting officers, should be in control of the agreements. People who have a business background, people who have a mission to accomplish, who have the budget to effectuate that mission.
This point, unfortunately, does offend many in the contracting world, and it's not meant to. It's not meant to. And again, as you said, they're being poorly served.
Well, a couple of points. I mean, we don't need to ramble on this, but a couple of points. 3 years ago, I spoke to Jim Woolsey, the head of the Defense Acquisition University, and brought up this idea that you don't need to be a warranted FAR contracting officer to operate in the OT world. He was shocked. Thought it never crossed his mind that there was a fundamental difference between OT agreements and FAR contracts. And I think that view is reflected by many people. I mean, we hear this, just another tool in the toolkit. It's just a slight perturbation of contracting. The contract office knows all about that. Well, again, at DARPA, what we did is originally the signer of an agreement was the director. Well, once we started picking up the volume of OT agreements, that couldn't continue. So that was delegated down to the assistant director for management. And eventually we got the contracting officers in the contract management office involved. We had only experienced contracting officers. Half of them had the time of their lives operating in an OT environment, and half of them were completely incapable of operating in an OT environment. The OT guide said, you can look at it and say, well, the OT guide says you don't need to be a warranted FAR contracting officer to be an agreements officer. But if you look at the actual words, it doesn't really allow, it aims at FAR contract. A warranted individual, first of all, we call them warranted. They don't have to be warranted. They just have to receive a delegation of authority to enter into, administer, and terminate other transactions. Now we say must possess a level of responsibility, business acumen, and judgment that enables them to operate in the relatively unstructured environment. Yes. But then at the end, AOs need not be contracting officers. Yes. But unless required by the component's appointment process, and virtually every component has required AOs to be warranted contracting officers. And they just haven't realized the different environments involved and the skills involved. It may be that program managers be the signatories of other transactions. It may be that people with a scientific background, a background in industry, are the right person on the team to either sign the agreement or to be the person in charge of changes within the agreement. So, we've basically beaten this horse, and the message that I want to get out to folks is that serious consideration should be given to who in your organization, who in the workforce has the kind of talents that would make a good agreements officer. And by the way, in addition to the talents, have they received the right kind of education? Have they received an education that allows them to open the aperture and look at all of the possibilities for structuring an agreement to support a program? So that's sort of the message, and we hope that folks will who are in charge of appointing agreements officers will realize that there's an issue here that the department needs to give serious consideration support the workforce, get the right people doing the right job, and I think things will improve on the front of other transactions, and the science and technology and prototyping and systems acquisition mission of the agency.
Let's go AO. All right. Well, if you would like to find out more about agreements officers, other transactions, and innovative contracting, visit us at strategicinstitute.org.